This Arctic blast is not ending anytime soon. The brutal cold that has gripped the eastern United States for the past week will continue through the entire month of February, and the meteorological evidence supporting this forecast is both compelling and deeply concerning for millions of Americans who face unprecedented challenges ahead. What we are witnessing is not a typical cold snap that moves through and clears out within a few days. The Climate Prediction Center has issued their February temperature outlook with unusually high confidence, showing below average temperatures across the entire eastern half of the United States for the remainder of the month. This is not a speculative forecast based on limited data. This represents a consensus among multiple weather models and represents the kind of pattern recognition that meteorologists develop confidence in only when the atmospheric setup is particularly clear, persistent, and backed by decades of similar historical precedents. And this pattern is already proving its durability right now through observable impacts that continue expanding. The polar vortex disruption that began in late January has created what atmospheric scientists call a negative Arctic oscillation pattern that shows remarkable persistence across multiple forecast models. Under normal winter conditions, the polar vortex acts as a containment system, keeping the coldest air bottled up over the Arctic regions through a complex interaction of temperature gradients, pressure systems, and upper-level wind patterns that maintain atmospheric equilibrium. When the system weakens or breaks down completely, that frigid air has nowhere to go except south. The geographical layout of North America, with its lack of east-west mountain barriers, makes the eastern United States a natural destination for these Arctic air masses that can maintain their intensity across thousands of miles of southward movement. Current observations show that temperatures across Wisconsin have already reached minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, marking the coldest readings in that region since 2019, while Minnesota has recorded wind chills approaching minus 60 degrees in multiple locations. These are not overnight aberrations or isolated measurement errors. These temperatures reflect the establishment of a persistent Arctic air mass that shows no signs of weakening or retreating northward, and more concerning, continues to reinforce itself through radiational cooling and high-pressure dominance that creates a feedback loop of sustained cold conditions. This is where the situation becomes more serious than routine winter weather. The stratospheric warming event that triggered this polar vortex breakdown occurred in the upper levels of the atmosphere, roughly 15 to 30 miles above the Earth's surface, where temperatures normally decrease with altitude, but suddenly reverse this pattern due to complex wave interactions between different atmospheric layers. When sudden stratospheric warming events occur, they create a cascading effect that eventually reaches surface weather patterns. But this process happens slowly, over the course of weeks rather than days, which means the impacts we are experiencing now represent only the initial phase of a much longer atmospheric reorganization. The critical detail that many people do not understand is that once this process begins, it becomes self-reinforcing through multiple interconnected mechanisms. Cold surface temperatures create high-pressure systems that help maintain the atmospheric pattern that keeps bringing more cold air south, while simultaneously the jet stream becomes locked in a configuration that prevents the normal west-to-east flow of milder air masses. This feedback loop can persist for much longer periods than typical weather systems, which is exactly what happened during the 2013-2014 winter that many meteorologists still reference as a benchmark for extreme cold patterns that lasted months rather than weeks. Historical analysis of similar atmospheric setups shows that when polar vortex disruptions occur in late January, the resulting cold patterns typically persist for 4 to 8 weeks, with some documented cases extending into early April when spring warming finally overcomes the established pattern. We are currently in week 2 of this pattern, which means we are likely facing another month of well below normal temperatures across much of the eastern United States, and potentially longer if the stratospheric conditions continue to support the negative Arctic oscillation that drives this pattern. For millions of people, this changes daily routines significantly. The energy implications of prolonged extreme cold create compounding problems that extend well beyond individual comfort and enter territory that threatens grid stability across multiple regions. Electric utility companies across the affected region are already implementing demand management protocols, asking customers to reduce electricity usage during peak heating periods, which typically occur between 5 and 9 in the morning when heating systems work hardest after overnight temperature drops. Duke Energy has requested voluntary conservation measures from customers in the Carolinas during these specific time windows. Similar requests are being made by utility companies from Texas through New England, indicating the widespread nature of grid stress that occurs when demand exceeds normal winter planning parameters. These conservation requests reflect the reality that electric grid systems face maximum stress when temperatures remain consistently below normal for extended periods, rather than just peak during isolated cold snaps. Natural gas supplies also become strained when heating demand remains elevated for weeks rather than just a few days, creating pressure on pipeline systems, storage facilities, and distribution networks that were designed for typical seasonal demand patterns, rather than sustained emergency-level consumption. The infrastructure that delivers energy to homes and businesses was designed to handle typical winter conditions with safety margins built for short-term extreme events, not the sustained extreme cold that appears to be settling in for the remainder of February and potentially into March. Industrial facilities throughout the affected region face operational challenges that extend beyond heating costs into production disruptions, equipment failures, and worker safety concerns that accumulate over time. Manufacturing processes that depend on consistent temperatures struggle when facilities cannot maintain normal operating conditions despite maximum heating system output. Chemical plants, food processing facilities, and pharmaceutical manufacturing operations face particular challenges when sustained cold affects product quality, equipment reliability, and safety systems that must function within narrow temperature ranges regardless of outdoor conditions. But this is only the beginning of the infrastructure challenges. Transportation systems across the northern tier of states continue to experience disruptions that cascade throughout the national network. Airlines have canceled thousands of flights, not just because of current weather conditions, but because of the ongoing operational challenges that extreme cold creates for aircraft operations, ground crews, and passenger safety. The ripple effects extend to freight transportation, which carries goods throughout the country regardless of weather conditions under normal circumstances. When temperatures drop below operational thresholds for extended periods, trucking companies face equipment failures, delayed deliveries, and increased accident risks that affect supply chains serving areas far from the cold zones. This detail quietly shapes everyday life for everyone. The agricultural implications of sustained extreme cold reach beyond the current growing season and extend into long-term food production concerns that could affect markets throughout the year. Livestock operations from the Dakotas through Georgia are implementing emergency protocols to protect animals from temperatures that can cause serious harm or death within hours of exposure, requiring around-the-clock monitoring, additional shelter construction, and backup heating systems that consume enormous amounts of energy. Feed costs increase dramatically when animals require additional calories to maintain body temperature, while water systems freeze despite heating elements requiring constant attention and emergency interventions that strain both labor resources and operating budgets. Fruit and vegetable crops in southern states that normally experience only occasional freezing temperatures face potential damage that could affect food supplies and pricing for months after the cold pattern eventually ends. Florida citrus growers, who have been monitoring temperatures carefully since the Arctic air began moving south, now face the prospect of consecutive nights of damaging cold temperatures that could impact citrus production for the entire year, with some estimates suggesting crop losses that could reach hundreds of millions of dollars if the cold persists. Through mid-February, as forecast models indicate, the economic ripple effects extend far beyond agriculture into transportation, retail, construction, and service sectors that must continue operating under conditions that increase costs, reduce efficiency, and create safety challenges that require additional staffing and equipment. Supply chains face disruptions that cascade through multiple industries, creating shortages, price increases, and delivery delays that affect consumers across the nation. Emergency management officials throughout the affected region have shifted from short-term cold weather response to sustained winter operations that require different resources and planning approaches. Warming centers that might typically operate for 2 or 3 days during routine cold snaps now need supplies, staffing, and funding to remain operational for potentially several weeks. This is not days away. This is happening right now and will continue. The human health implications of prolonged extreme cold become exponentially more serious when people must endure these conditions for weeks rather than days. Hypothermia and frostbite risks increase dramatically when there are fewer opportunities for recovery between cold episodes. Vulnerable populations, including elderly residents, people without reliable heating, and those experiencing homelessness, face cumulative health risks that emergency services are struggling to address with normal protocols. Power outage restoration becomes significantly more complicated when repair crews must work in sustained extreme cold conditions. Equipment failures increase when temperatures remain below normal operating ranges for extended periods. Even routine maintenance becomes dangerous when wind chills consistently reach levels that can cause frostbite within minutes of skin exposure. The economic costs of this sustained cold pattern accumulate daily across multiple sectors. Heating bills for residential and commercial customers will reflect not just colder temperatures, but sustained high energy usage over an extended period. Insurance, claims for frozen pipes, equipment failures, and weather-related accidents continue mounting as long as the extreme conditions persist. After this point, normal patterns become increasingly difficult to restore. Construction projects throughout the affected region face delays that extend beyond the immediate weather impacts. Concrete cannot cure properly in extreme cold. Equipment fails more frequently. Worker safety protocols require modified schedules that reduce productivity. These delays create cascading effects in project timelines that can extend months beyond the actual cold weather period. The atmospheric pattern supporting this extended cold spell shows remarkable persistence in multiple weather prediction models. The European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, generally considered the most reliable long-range forecast model, shows the negative Arctic oscillation pattern maintaining itself through at least the third week of February. The American Global Forecast System shows similar persistence, as do most of the ensemble forecast systems that meteorologists use to assess pattern reliability. This level of model agreement on extended patterns is relatively rare and indicates that the atmospheric configuration driving this cold spell has the kind of stability that can maintain itself for weeks rather than days. The jet stream pattern that typically brings changes in weather systems has become locked in a configuration that continues to direct Arctic air masses southward while blocking the westerly flow that would normally bring milder air from the Pacific Ocean. What follows tends to be more entrenched rather than temporary. The snowpack that has accumulated across much of the northern United States will help maintain cold surface temperatures even during periods when solar heating might normally begin to moderate the Arctic air masses. Fresh snow reflects solar radiation back to space rather than allowing it to warm the ground, creating a feedback mechanism that helps sustain cold surface temperatures for longer periods. Ground temperatures throughout the affected region have dropped well below freezing and will remain there for the duration of this cold pattern. This creates ongoing challenges for underground utilities, foundation systems, and any infrastructure that depends on normal soil temperatures. Water main breaks become more frequent when ground frost penetrates deeper than normal design specifications anticipate. The seasonal progression towards spring, which normally begins to moderate winter weather patterns by mid-February, will be delayed by several weeks if this atmospheric pattern continues as forecast. Even when temperatures eventually begin to moderate, the recovery toward normal seasonal temperatures will happen more gradually because of the deep cold that has penetrated both the atmosphere and the ground surface. Once this phase locks in, options narrow quickly. The public health preparedness systems throughout the affected region are shifting from acute emergency response to sustained cold weather operations that require different resources and strategies. Emergency departments are seeing increased cases of cold-related injuries and illnesses, but they are also preparing for the cumulative health effects that develop when people must cope with extreme cold for extended periods. Mental health impacts of prolonged extreme weather create additional challenges for communities already dealing with the physical and economic stresses of the cold pattern. Seasonal affective disorders become more pronounced when winter conditions are both more severe and longer lasting than people anticipate. Social isolation increases when travel becomes consistently difficult rather than occasionally inconvenient. The infrastructure that supports daily life throughout the affected region faces sustained stress rather than the brief challenges that typical winter weather creates. Water treatment plants, sewage systems, communication networks, and transportation systems must continue operating under conditions that exceed their normal design parameters, not just for days, but for weeks. This is a setup that tests every margin built into the systems people depend on. Educational institutions, from elementary schools through universities, have been forced to modify their winter semester schedules repeatedly as extreme cold days accumulate beyond the typical allowances for weather-related closures. Some districts are beginning to implement extended spring semesters to compensate for instructional time lost to weather conditions that show no signs of moderating on any predictable timeline. The energy sector faces sustained demand that exceeds typical winter peak loads, not just during the coldest days, but consistently throughout the extended cold period. Natural gas storage levels, which normally decline gradually throughout a typical winter, are dropping at accelerated rates that raise concerns about supply adequacy if the pattern continues through March, which some long-range indicators suggest remains possible. Regional economic impacts accumulate as businesses throughout the affected area deal with increased heating costs, employee productivity challenges, supply chain disruptions, and customer accessibility problems that persist for weeks rather than resolving after a few days of extreme weather. This pattern represents exactly the kind of sustained winter weather that communities often underestimate until recovery becomes the primary challenge rather than simply enduring the immediate conditions. The meteorological mechanisms that created this situation remain firmly in place, and the long-range forecast models show no clear signals for pattern change through the remainder of February. The polar vortex disruption that triggered this extended cold spell appears to have established an atmospheric configuration that will maintain itself well into March before any significant moderation becomes likely. This is a winter pattern that will be remembered long after the snow melts and temperatures return to normal.